What's up, MetaNerds? This video is going to cover the Flood. We'll start with their origins, explain their stages and ultimate goal, and then continue their history from millions of years ago up through the 26th century, when Master Chief would face them on Installation 04. There's a lot to cover here, so let's just jump into it. The Flood has an ancient history that can be traced back to the Masters of the Galaxy that ruled before the Forerunners, a race of primordial beings called the Precursors. The Precursors were hyper-intelligent and possessed the power to control time and space, being able to traverse the universe and gave rise to intelligent life. The Precursors themselves have no single shape, but were able to take any form that they saw fit. But a lot of the examples we have are these gargantuan, grotesque creatures. The Forerunners believed they were made in the image of the Precursors, as well as being the rightful successors to what they called the Mantle of Responsibility. To put it simply, whoever ruled the galaxy took up this mantle, meaning they were the guardians for keeping the galaxy safe and prosperous, ensuring that this phenomenon we call life never disappears from the universe. The Precursors did originally see the Forerunners as the next being to take up this mantle, the next species most capable of curating life in the galaxy. However, they eventually deemed the Forerunners unworthy, and instead chose to make humans their successors. Furious and kinda proving their master's point, the Forerunners revolted against the Precursors and wiped most of them out in a violent display of genocide. But this would not be the end of the Precursors, as a few managed to escape to the fringes of space, and using that shape-shifting ability, reduced themselves into a dust that could later regenerate into their natural forms. Millions of years passed, and the Forerunners solidified their control of the galaxy. But the Precursors would not stay in this dust form. Over these thousands of millennia that it was left in stasis, the biological structure of this dust started to corrupt, causing anyone who came in contact with it to fall into madness and hysteria. And as you might be predicting, these Precursors, whose existence once revolved around preserving the Mantle of Responsibility, protecting and propagating life throughout the universe, had mutated into its greatest threat, the Flood. So how does it actually work? Well, the Flood spreads like any other disease or illness, passing from those who are infected to new hosts through contact and airborne spores. But the Flood is frighteningly intelligent, and coming from the Precursors, that isn't too surprising. There are 4 developmental stages of the Flood. The first is the feral stage. In this form, they are as small as individual Flood supercells mutating in a host, and then eventually the larger airborne Flood spores. Though almost any macroscopic life form can be infected, the goal is to find sentient life. And even though this simpler form of the Flood is not itself considered intelligent or sentient yet, it having a goal really is the right word to describe it, as all the studies by both humans and Forerunners show that even these simpler forms somehow actively seek out intelligent life, as nerves and cerebral tissue are vital for growing into more complex forms. Remember, the ability of the Precursors to morph their biology was what enabled them to become the dormant dust forms that would later become the Flood. And so once a host is found, the parasite was able to mesh with the victim's body. Here we see them scaling up to pod infectors, which was now the main way of grabbing targets. At this stage, they are still acting independently, but through the releasing and detecting of pheromones, they can tell where other pods are swarming and pick up on prey. Of all the things they're seeking to amass, besides the nerves and brain matter, is actually calcium. To get it, these pods will usually leap at a torso and try and bury into the chest, either burrowing in directly or strangling the victim first. It immediately starts pumping Flood supercells into the blood system, where they essentially are curating the host cells how the Flood wants. Just as the Precursors used to when they were the galaxy's wise, life-grooming benefactors, the genetic code itself is being altered. This process can be completed in as little as a few seconds. Organs and bones are pushed aside, or simply dissolved for matter to be shaped how the parasite sees fit. Hacking into the nervous system and brain, the pod has become at least as intelligent as the host was, allowing it to attack more victims, and even use their tech, everything from weapons to starships. Other times the host body will be used as a sort of incubator, swelling up with enormous blisters, till they eventually burst, releasing countless spores or more pods. A couple terrifying things to keep in mind here is that this process can be done on dead hosts as well, as long as their nervous system is not degenerated beyond use, and in living victims, the brain is chemically isolated from the rest of the host nervous system, while still being tapped into by the Flood. Essentially, it can access the brain, but the brain can no longer control the body. This whole process is repeated until enough biomass is acquired. A dark and simplistic way to view their victims, no matter what the species, their bodies are just matter. Building blocks that these degenerated Precursors are able to shape into their next step, the proto-grave mind. This monstrosity's method of communication is not fully known, but it is confirmed to speak to its victims telepathically, and so we can assume it's the same for all the Flood underlings, under the command of the Proto-Gravemind. This is likely achieved because the Precursors were the only known species to have mastered neural physics, which a grossly oversimplified way to summarize that concept would be to think of it as consciousness and energy itself as forms of matter, or vice versa. It's so esoteric that even the Forerunners never fully figured it out, and it allowed the Precursors one of their versions of faster-than-light travel, but also using thoughts to morph your environment and even your own body. One of the closest things the Forerunners have to it would be the domain, a kind of metaphysical internet containing all of their society's knowledge and individual experiences, which you could say are hosted on the servers that are made up of the fabric of the universe itself. An example of how this is actually connected to physics is that during the Forerunner Flood War, the Forerunners experienced issues with slip space, as this neural physics aspect of reality was being infected by the Flood as well. Literally, the fabric of space was being altered. And so this telepathic central mind continues plotting to gather more biomass, while also gaining some new abilities. One is that it could alter radio signals. It's unknown how it does this, but I would guess it has something to do with that neural physics, interrupting with electromagnetic communication as it's some sort of other unknown wavelength. It's also more active in the retrieval of information, now telepathically interrogating victims. Those who fell to the lower Flood would have felt death, a loss of consciousness, even if their brains and memories were still being accessed by the Flood. But a proto-Gravemind victim is still conscious during this process for a long time, mentally poked and prodded until it feels that it has gained everything. All the while, the victim is experiencing an insanity-inducing loud buzzing sound until that victim does eventually lose consciousness and is released into the void of death. The Flood has now reached Stage 2, the Coordinated Stage. Here the Flood is pursuing two goals: upgrading its intelligence into a fully fledged Gravemind, and conquering the entire local ecosystem, aligning all biomass available to this one goal. Flood hives are like larger versions of the carrier form, but swallow up whole fields, and even grow as large as mountains, spewing spores into the atmosphere that eventually take the entire planet. Old combat forms are morphed into carriers, which then spread to create new troops. While all of this organic raw material is being organized and morphed to add to the proto, eventually becoming a full Gravemind. Remember, each of the intelligent creatures hijacked by the Flood are linked by this centralized intelligence. As many neurons build a brain, these countless intelligent individuals are linked in a sort of neural network, creating the Flood's new brain. And the Gravemind that arises is able to craft a new life form with all of this biomass to work with, called pure forms. These are similar to the combat forms, but don't require infecting a host. They are made purely by the building blocks that were liquefied via the supercells, though the bones of conquered foe are often used as scaffolding to build off of. But this incarnation can mutate between at least 3 forms depending on the situation. There will also be the creation of blightlands, and lakes of a pus and mucus-like material that was used as food for this vast plague army. It is said that in this state, the Flood has created its own self-sustaining ecosystem, Flood living, dying, and dissolving into food to be used by a new generation of Flood in perpetuity, just as the cow eats the grass, dies, and becomes the grass. With that immensely powerful Gravemind, it can devise ways to escape this ecosystem as well. This is now Stage 3, the Interstellar Stage. This marks not so much a drastic change in biology, but more a substantial change in action and intellect. With all those intelligent minds absorbed, the Gravemind has even figured out how to outsmart AIs. This so-called logic plague, because it essentially does to the AI what the parasite does to the flesh. Its whole being is now consumed with carrying out the Flood's ultimate goal. The Precursors placed themselves in that original dust form on the fringes of the galaxy, and it would spread in a spiral towards the center, until the entire galaxy was one massive Flood hive. One giant, exclusively Flood ecosystem. But still, this is not considered victory. The 4th and final stage of the Flood is the Transgalactic Stage, where the Flood has the intelligence and technical ability to spread beyond our Milky Way galaxy, spreading over eternity, until life itself means only Flood. Keep in mind that the Precursors themselves were said to have originated from outside of our galaxy, and it's interesting to consider that their goal as peacekeepers was to ensure that the universe never reverts to a time without this emergent, beautiful phenomenon we call life. Though this grotesque form of life may be devoid of what we see as giving life meaning, it would certainly be resilient. The ideals may have died, but not life itself. And so we must consider if a universe-enveloping Flood does actually align with the Precursors' mantle of responsibility. So now that you know how it works and their ultimate goal, let's go back to first contact. Circa 110,000 BCE, humans were the first to encounter the corrupted precursor dust, finding the strange powdery substance in ancient derelict ships that were floating through space. The origins and purpose of this dust were unknown, so in controlled experiments, humans decided to test it on lower life forms, and eventually on the dog-like creatures used as house pets by humans and the Sanshum, a species called the Feru. For hundreds of years, the only obvious effect was that it made the pets more docile, but slowly, it was altering the Feru's genetic code. At first, these were just desirable physical mutations, forming things like interesting fur patterns. But over many more centuries, however, long fleshy rods and growths started plaguing the entire species. The infection, as it was now called, then jumped over to humans, who in turn spread it to the neighboring Sanshum Empire. And each of these infected, from the pets to their owner to their friendly alien species, became fiercely cannibalistic and sought to further spread this disease. By now, the flood infection was no longer just a disease of the mind. Instead of hysteria, those infected began to rapidly mutate into grotesque physical forms. Those infected were driven to accumulate more biomass. The infection quickly spread, and every attempt made by the human empire failed, as over 100 worlds fell to the flood. This wave crashed into the outer fringes of Forerunner space, and the human fleets were quick to quarantine the outbreak. Infected Forerunner ships were destroyed, and eventually entire Forerunner planets were burned by the humans, ironically using similar weapons and tactics that the Covenant would use nearly 100,000 years later, when they would glass human colonies. The Forerunners were outraged by this newfound aggression by the humans, not fully appreciating the threat of the flood. All the Forerunners could see were human fleets destroying Forerunner planets and killing billions in what was seen as an aggressive expansionist movement, basically seeing the humans as using the flood as an excuse, as humanity was relocating those who had to flee from those infected worlds. This began the long and brutal Human Forerunner War. So now humanity was caught in between two deadly foes, the Flood and the Forerunner Empire, and as you might expect, they were losing on both fronts. This changed, however, when the Flood suddenly retreated from the galaxy, abandoning human space in a hurry. Just as the Forerunners were coming to see the existence of the Flood as a true danger to the galaxy, they were confused as to why the human worlds were now clean of the parasite, and concluded that humanity must have developed some kind of cure. They demanded that the humans turn that cure over, but humanity swore that no such cure for the Flood actually existed. They claimed to be just as confused by the Flood's retreat as the Forerunners. But the Didact, the leader of the Forerunners' military, would later speculate that in its powerful, calculating collective consciousness, the Flood intended it to appear as if humans had a cure, letting these two races turn on each other instead of fighting it. And the Forerunner were far more advanced than humanity, running the Ecumene, which was a galaxy-spanning empire, incorporating thousands of different species, and thus humanity did not survive this war. The Forerunners had them punished severely for their apparent war crimes, and the sentence was to have them genetically devolved, reducing humanity from spacefaring to a primitive state, and exiling them to their homeworld of Erde Tyrene, also known as Earth. With a majority of the Flood gone from the galaxy and the humans defeated, the Forerunners were able to have some success in their war with the parasite. Small pockets of infection were sterilized and worlds were cleansed, but this ease would not last. With the humans gone, the Flood would soon return in full force and began to wage war on the Forerunner Empire, with those once powerful humans who may have teamed up with them against the Flood currently trying to figure out how to sharpen sticks to keep back big cats. When the Flood returned, it spread throughout Forerunner space and infected every world it touched, consuming billions of Forerunners and growing in size and intelligence. Grave minds formed, and the Flood became smarter, outmaneuvering Forerunner fleets and infecting the planets which they protected. The Flood was able to bypass their defense fleets by infecting civilian ships, and then slipping past the blockades to infect the planets themselves. Flood was also capable of using its own fleets of infected ships to swarm the Forerunner fleets and then infect those too, snowballing the strength of its own forces in the process. And though the Forerunners now saw it as a real threat, they still didn't fully grasp how intelligent it was, treating it more like a typical disease and attempting to quarantine it, rather than mobilizing for a full-scale war against an intelligent enemy. And once the Ecumene started losing whole planets, the Forerunners saw why the humans were glassing entire worlds, as they now saw that the only solution was to destroy their own worlds to try and stop the spread. And it was this idea of destroying potential Flood hosts that was the seed that would grow into the idea of the Halo Array. But there was one more terrifying element of the Flood left to reveal itself: the Logic Plague. The Flood can infect more than just organic beings. It can even infect artificial intelligences, out-reasoning these digital forms of life. The greatest example of this so far is in the fall of Mendicant Bias, a contender-class Forerunner AI. It was the chief intelligence in charge of leading the war efforts against the Flood, and was designed to be able to break into multiple pieces so that it could run different projects at once. If you saw our video on High Charity, a fragment of Mendicant Bias was stored on the Forerunner Dreadnought that powered the Covenant Holy City. And while this AI was organizing the Forerunners' war against the Flood, one of its tasks was interrogating a captured gravemind called the Primordial, but this assignment proved to be the Forerunners' undoing. During this interrogation, the gravemind was able to talk to Mendicant Bias and convince the AI that the Flood was the true descendant of the Precursors, and that it was the Forerunners who defied their masters and wrongfully seized control of the galaxy for themselves. To the gravemind's credit, this is actually true, and the logic was sound enough to infect Mendicant Bias with the Logic Plague, the AI equivalent of being affected by the Flood. And so the AI meant to lead Forerunner forces against the Flood was now working with the Primordial Gravemind to infest the Ecumene. To counter this, the Forerunners desperately created a new AI that was just as smart as Mendicant, but lacked the same creative thinking, called Offensive Bias. It would take control of Forerunner forces and combat these AI-aided Flood fleets. One of the many plans tried by the Forerunners to save themselves from the Flood was the use of shield worlds, artificial planets that were surrounded by an impenetrable shield. These would act as a sort of ark, where the Forerunners and other flora and fauna would be able to hide, while the Flood was raging outside. One famous example of a shield world is Requiem. Unfortunately, the locations of these shield worlds were found out by the Flood, and most were lost to the Parasite. The UNSC's Spirit of Fire found one of these fallen shield worlds, where its outer shell was totally covered with Flood biomass, and there were even trace amounts of Flood outbreaks inside of this shield world. And then there was option 2. The Halo Array was the last resort in the final days of the Forerunners' feudal war against the ever-growing Flood infestation. When all other options had been exhausted and all hope seemed lost, what little remained of the Forerunners was determined that the only way to stop the Flood was to annihilate all life in the galaxy, because the Flood needed a constant source of food to survive. Depriving the infestation of that food source would cause it to starve to death. And thus, at the very least, the Flood would not spread to other galaxies. And this is where the rings come into play. This effort took a few tries, but the final project resulted in the collection of several gargantuan rings measuring thousands of kilometers in diameter. But the Didact, the leader of the Forerunners' forces, did not agree with the idea of these rings, so he devised his own plan to stop the Flood. This resulted in the creation of the Composer, a device that converted living organisms into a digital state. With this, the Didact hoped to make himself and his warriors immune to Flood infection, but the results did not work the way he wanted, as his copy was not perfect, and even in these digital states they were still vulnerable to Flood infection, but the Composer still had some uses he sought to exploit. The Didact retained a great resentment for humanity after the apparent atrocities that they committed during the Human Forerunner War. So he brought the Composer to Erde Tyrene, used it on primitive humans, turning them into these digital spirits that he used to build an army of mechanical warriors called the Prometheans. He would go on to use these capable warriors against the Flood, but not to the levels of success he was hoping. His wife, the Librarian, was appalled by his actions against humanity, and had the Didact imprisoned in the Shield World Requiem, which would end up saving him from the firing of the Halo Array. Mendicant Bias and the Flood learned of the Forerunners' plan to fire the Halo Array, and brought the fight to the final stronghold, the Lesser Ark, where the Forerunners prepared to fire all of the rings at once, while Offensive Bias commanded the Forerunner fleets in defense of the Ark against this rival AI and the armada of Flood-infected ships. The Forerunners were able to hold them off long enough to fire the Halo rings, and in an instant, a war lasting thousands of years was over, as the Flood was wiped from the galaxy, along with all other living creatures, except for those few who happened to find themselves on specific Forerunner structures. When activated, the Halo rings would emit a blast of radiation that would sweep throughout the entire galaxy. And aside from saving other galaxies, in theory it would only destroy things down to a certain scale. The blast is composed of supermassive neutrinos that pass through objects at a frequency that only destroys nervous systems. Any neural structures, surprisingly even the neural physics structures of the Precursors, along with the biological nervous systems for everything from Forerunners down to tadpoles, were completely disintegrated, while microscopic life and even most plant life in the galaxy would remain intact. They also cataloged as much of the macroscopic life as they could. And though thousands of forms of life would be lost forever, there were also countless forms that were saved, storing everything from DNA samples, embryos, and even fully grown living specimen. After the Halo rings were fired, and the galaxy was thought cleansed of this parasite, Automated systems packed these samples onto ships, which took them to their respective homeworlds, reseeding and resetting life in the Milky Way galaxy. But the Forerunners themselves were considered destroyed, leaving behind only their technology and weapons. Over the Lesser Ark, Offensive Bias and Mendicant Bias continued to battle. But without the Flood, Mendicant Bias's fleet was decimated by Offensive Bias, who had taken over all of the Forerunner ships left under his command. Mendicant Bias was fragmented as per the instructions, and one piece was left on the Ark, later to be encountered by the Master Chief in Halo 3. And so how did the Flood survive? Well, the answer lies in those arcs that were intended to save the Forerunners. Flood-infected shield worlds were protected by the Halo Ray, laying in wait for many more millennia until travelers came across them like the ones encountered by the UNSC Spirit of Fire. The Forerunners also managed to save numerous Flood specimens on the Halo rings themselves, which weren't affected by that galaxy-sweeping burst, and these specimens would survive in stasis, only to be released during the chaos of the Human Covenant War. But remember, as the Precursors are said to come from beyond our galaxy, it's very possible that there are pockets of Flood outside of the Milky Way galaxy, outside of the reach of the Halo arrays, waiting to return. So that's it for the history of the Flood. If you want to connect with us on social media, find ways that you can help support this channel for free, or check out our Patreon and PayPal, be sure to check out the links in the description. Special shout out to our supporters over on Patreon, especially our $25 tier, Andrew Bann, Black Phoenix, Feed Me Kittens, and Seraph Diaz. But most important of all, remember, don't feed strange space dust to your dog, and the mantle of responsibility will stay with you, always.